Good morning, y'all. It's Miss Boyst, and I am picking up where we left off in the reading of Bronx Masquerade. If you are reading in the book version, we are starting on page 87, and if you are reading the online version, then we are starting on page. It's coming on page 84. Okay, so Sterling Hughes. Devon shook his head when he saw me standing in the lunch line yesterday, fingering an imaginary fret, making the appropriate sound effects. Friend or not, he thinks I'm crazy, but the brother behind me got into it too, snapping his fingers to the rhythm I set. Yeah, he said, preacher got it going on. My name is Sterling Sampson, but everyone calls me preacher. I intend to become a science teacher, not a preacher, but I don't mind being called one, just so long as you don't call me Sampson. I'm hoping to end up in a little better shape than he did. I turned to the brother behind me and eased into a smile. I play a real guitar at church every Sunday. You ought to come by and check me out sometime. Judging by the way the brother cuts his eyes at me, his appearance on the steps of First Baptist Church seemed highly unlikely. Still, you never know. I went back to my invisible string playing to keep my fingers limber for later. I had promised to hold the bass line for some of the brothers' reading at this week's open mic. Mr. Ward was kind enough to lock my guitar up in his office in the morning so I wouldn't have to worry about it walking away before then, assuming I made it to class without any trouble. A brother named Leon accidentally bumped into me as I approached the cashier. He spilled, or should I say poured, a cup full of honey on my shoes, my new shoes. Oops, looks like Mr. Goody Two Shoes got a mess to clean up, he said, laughing. His buddies joined in. I stared down at my shoes, counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time I reached 10, I realized counting was not going to suffice. I need you, Lord. Hold back the Samson in me. I may not have his strength, but you know I have his temper. I counted backward from 10, felt my breath slowly evening out. A still, small voice reminded me to return good for evil, reminded me that my plans for the future do not include fisticuffs or expulsion. I am college bound, and nothing is going to keep me from it. Besides, these poor fools are only trying to get a rise out of me. They're only trying to prove that the peace of God is non existent. But how can they? I looked up at Leon and shook my head. Then I grabbed him by the shoulders, kissed him loudly on both cheeks, and gave him a bear hug. Get off me, man, he said, trying to pull away. When I finally let him go, he whispered, Leon, if I forgive you. Fear blotted out the pupils in his eyes. Man, he yelled, you some kind of freak. I smiled, strummed my imaginary guitar, and sang, I'll be a fool for Christ, not just once, but twice. Leon and his friends backed away as if I'd set a match on them. They put as much distance between us as possible. You sick man, Leon called over his shoulder. Stay away from me. It's always something with these guys. Either they're trying to draw me into an infantile game of the dozens so we can trade insults left and right, or they're slapping porno pictures inside my locker, hoping to set me off. If they had some direction in their lives like Raoul, Devon, or Renard, they wouldn't have time to worry about me one way or the other, which is precisely why I want to teach, to give young brothers like Leon some direction. Even Wesley has direction, although the brother could clean up his language. Sometimes he sounds like a thug in training. Leon's not much better. If Leon and his friends knew how lame their antics are, if only they knew how lame their antics are, as if any of that could stop me from believing in God. All my life, I've seen my mother pray, and all my life, I've seen her prayers answered. There was the time my baby brother was dying of pneumonia and the doctors had given up, but she prayed until the fever broke. There was the time that she was laid off from her job and the refrigerator was empty, and she bowed her head over an empty pot and prayed for God to fill it. That night, a woman upstairs begged her to accept a bag of frozen meats and vegetables because she was moving the next day and she hated to see good food go to waste. We had steaks that night, and we never have steaks. There were lots of times like that. See there, Mom would say, That's God's hand. If you have God's hand in your life, everything will be all right. So, of course, I believe, and I believe big. I'm believing God's going to get me and my brothers into manhood, into college, and off these streets with no more than maybe a couple of black eyes between us. How's that for believing? The change bell rang and I was still cleaning my shoes off. I could have used a few extra minutes to work on my own poem. It took me a while to get into the whole poetry thing. Not that I don't like it. I read God's Trombones by James Wilton Johnson and some of the work by County Cullen, like Simon the Syrian speaks. And I like what the brothers had to say, but their styles don't suit me. Then Mr. Ward turned me on to Rev. Pedro Pietri, who is more my speed, even if he is kind of old. He knows how to put God and the street in the same sentence, and I figured if I'm going to write poetry at all, that's what I want to do. So I put together a few. I couldn't tell if they were any good, but I decided to read one anyway. If I get a laugh, it won't be the first time. The bell rang one last time. I took a few bites of my sandwich, wrapped up the rest, and tossed it in my bookcase for later. I told my growling stomach to be quiet and headed to Mr. Ward's office for my guitar. D-Train by Sterling S. Hughes. He squeezed through the subway doors, a young gun, thirsty for the kind of coke you can't sip through a straw. He sized up the passengers, chose his prey, a wrinkled woman at the tail end of her genital years who fears her own shadow with good reason. He lunged at her, demanded her cash to replenish his stash of powdered death. No one blinked or came to her aid at first. Then in he beamed. Light streamed from his fingers, singed anyone caught without a robe of righteousness across his back. The lack of goodness in the young gun's heart was oxygen to the fire, and so he burned a good long while before I woke. The dream stoked my faith in the judgment and justice that will come someday, or this afternoon. Soon. I turn up the collar of my white robe, relieved to know God's got me covered, 'cause I'm good, but not that good. Tyrone. The brother took me to a whole other place. I'm still not sure I got it. I'm sorry. I'm not sure I got all of it, but I got that he don't call himself no angel. Of course, if Mr. Goody Two-Shoes ain't no angel, what does that make me? Never mind. He sure worked that rhythm. I know that much. He snuck a little rhyme in there, too. I like that. Go on, preacher. Look like God got himself a poet.